China will continue to increase investment in the least developed countries, aiming to increase its total to $12 billion by 2030.
China contributes the most international financial assistance of any developing country. We look at China's unique foreign aid model. Hello, I'm Nathan King in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. At a time when Western countries contract and shrink foreign aid funding, China expands its foreign assistance. It's the developing country that gives the most, and from 2010 to 2012, China provided foreign aid to 121 countries. China's foreign aid model focuses on South-South cooperation, or countries in the global South, providing funds to other developing countries. China also focuses on bilateral aid and infrastructure investment, as seen in its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
China will establish an assistance fund for South-South cooperation with an initial pledge of $2 billion in support of developing countries' implementation of the post-2015 development agenda.
As the international community focuses on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, China is committing itself to sustainable development internationally through investment. While China's foreign financial assistance crosses the globe, almost half of it ends up in African countries.
No matter how rapidly the international and regional landscapes change, African countries have remained the most faithful brothers of China, and China has been and remains one of Africa's most reliable partners. In recent years, we have held fast to solutions with Chinese characteristics and actively participated in Africa's peace and stability, gaining recognition and appreciation.
To explore China's foreign aid model in Africa, we are joined from Beijing by Wenping, Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. From the United Nations in New York, Ayodele Odusola. He is the Chief Economist for the United Nations Development Programme for Africa. And with me in the studio is Deborah Brautigam. She is the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Let's go to Beijing first. Wenping, China obviously growing in its aid overseas, especially in Africa. Nearly a majority of countries it gives to on the African continent. What are they contributing and why?
Well, yes, China has increased our development assistance to Africa year by year. Especially, everybody knows, last December, during the Chinese-African Johannesburg Summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping has made another new pledge as high as 60 billion US dollar. So among those 60 billion, I think also there are quite a lot of part will be the development assistance, that is the aid. The reason China has paid great attention to Africa, I think there are simply two reasons. Number one is Africa is the continent that badly needs development assistance to catch up with other continents in this global village. Because I think as many as 36, those least developed countries, among those 49 in whole of the world now are still African countries. So they need help. And the second reason is that China has a long tradition to providing aid to Africa. Ever since the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. So the following year, China has provided aid to Western African countries in agricultural development, and also later on, those development assistance has been goes to the industrialization and also to medical care, help, so and also education. So we have long history, and China also enjoy the we call all-weather friendship with Africa.
Right, thank you very much. I want to bring in Deborah here in the studio. He's right about China giving, basically since the founding of modern China, Bandung Conference, non-aligned movement, all that sort of stuff. But things have changed recently, and China's model of giving aid is very different from former colonial powers in the West, right?
that depends, actually. China's, Dr. Wenping mentioned, for example, this pledge of $60 billion. And I think it's important to disaggregate that into what is actually official development assistance and what is commercial instruments. And out of that 60 billion, really only 5 billion is traditional development assistance, grants and loans only coming in for development projects. The other 55 billion is much more commercial. It's investment funds in which Chinese companies will be encouraged to invest in industry and other sectors. And it's also commercial loans and preferential export credits. And these are all about business. And so in that sense, China's engagement in Africa is actually similar to European countries' engagement at an earlier period, which was a lot about driving business relationships and tying aid to companies coming from China as they were coming from Europe for the Europeans in the earlier period.
Ayodele, in New York, is Deborah right that a lot of this aid and, of course, investment, the two sometimes go hand in hand, is a Chinese model? There's a lot of emphasis on long-term loans, capacity building, infrastructure development, agricultural development, sometimes for profit, and then also sometimes, obviously, through aid mechanisms as well. Does that work well hand in hand?
All right. The Chinese aid to Africa is essentially focusing on the area of capacity development and infrastructure, and particularly almost about 51.8% of it on infrastructure. It's really a good idea because by the time we realize that the role of infrastructure in facilitating rapid economic growth and poverty reduction is very critical, we then know that spending such proportion of the aid in the area of infrastructure is in the right direction. One of the studies that is going on in the continent shows that if you increase access to electricity, for instance, by 1%, it reduces poverty by 0.62%. This is more or less a kind of action in the right direction. But again, we're not yet there. We need to really make sure it really manifests into a win-win development partnership and strategy in Africa.
Is that happening, do you believe?
Well, I think for it to happen, we need to really do a few things. One, the African government needs to have a strategic engagement approach that really helps to really direct investment or aid towards the national development priorities. And at the same time, they really need to put in place some kind of strategy that really diversify some of the Chinese engagement away from the extractive sector into the other sectors of the economy that drive economic growth and development simultaneously.
Dr. Wenping in Beijing, of course, China is the biggest contributor in aid of developing countries. It is worth noting China is still a developing country in some sense. Does the China development model, is that exportable, considering China's rapid rise?
China's development model, I think, is still in the process of development by ourselves. China's model, there are many different kind of explanations. For example, I think, to my understanding, the key element is to have a gradual reform, like to the try and error. So for Africa, recent years I traveled to many African countries. Yes, the fact is there is an increasing understanding that is called looking east policy, to see why the China and other emerging countries in the Asian countries they can develop so fast during such a short time. So they want to take those references of China's model, such as to develop those economic and trade industrial zone, and also how to develop infrastructure first to lay the foundation for the economic takeoff, and also like how to develop the township industry and to make the education like a training center. So all of that. So this is a very natural process because there is some commonality between China and Africa when both make their economic takeoff. in China, it's back to like 1970. Now in Africa, I think they have been done that reform also for quite a long time.
Deborah, I want to bring you in here. The flip side of that, some criticism is that China sometimes uses Africa for excess capacity in its own economy, that sometimes it's been exploitative, some Western powers too. What's your reaction to that?
I think there is a lot of complementarity between what African countries need and what China has to offer. And in terms of overcapacity, African countries are in huge need of infrastructure, and this is an area in overcapacity. If you think of concrete, steel, and then construction activities in China, these are cutting back after the stimulus of the last few decades. And so these companies are trying to get work abroad. And in Africa, Chinese construction companies are taking in revenues of about $50 billion a year. So this is a huge business market for them. And this is all to the good for African countries because they need that electricity, they need those roads, they need those hydropower plants. On the other hand, it's controversial as well. By my estimates and our estimates at the China-Africa Research Initiative, there is more construction activity going on than there is extractive activity going on.
So more building roads and railways rather than mining, is
in
what you're
terms
saying.
of the value, I think it's pretty clear. So there is mining investment, quite a bit of it. There is petroleum investment, but there hasn't been as much results from the petroleum investment. China does import a lot from Africa, but a lot of that is produced by non-Chinese companies, including African companies themselves. So the big area of business is really the construction industry.
Yeah, really interesting going forward. In terms of aid, Ayodele, in terms of aid to Africans who need it most, where are the Chinese priorities? Obviously, we've been talking about investments in infrastructure and transport and mining, but in terms of aid, where is it? Agriculture, capacity building for smaller communities?
Thank you very much. I think when it comes to the issue of investment in Africa, we have to focus on those areas that will help the African government to really implement their structural economic transformation, which they have all agreed to do. The first thing is we have to focus attention on increasing the agricultural productivity because that is where majority of the poor people in Africa live. Once we are able to enhance the income coming from that particular sector and the productivity, definitely we'll be able to dent inequality, poverty to a large extent. And again, we have to develop a kind of vocational skill. I know China has been focusing attention on that, but we need more effort in developing what we call the skill content of the youths so that they will be able to really transform the manufacturing sector as more or less moving away from the traditional sector into modern sector in a way that will generate employment, then that will deepen technology transfer, which we have not really seen for quite a while. Essentially, in the area of construction, which Chinese is really doing, some of the feedback we are getting from countries shows that there seems to be some kind of crowding out effect, meaning that some of the jobs that can be done by the nationals that have been done by the companies, Chinese, which they think is really edging them out of their skill and their jobs. This is an area which I think we need to really look into in making sure that it's a win-win situation whereby it enhances the absorption of the excess capacity in China, but also in generating decent jobs and employment opportunities for the African youths.